I always considered myself a balanced woman. Life in the Chicago suburbs, a cozy two-story house, a well-kept garden, and a husband who comes home after long weeks on the road. All of this seemed reliable enough to call it happiness. But happiness can be deceptive. Sometimes it's just an old blanket, warm but faded with time. My name is Laura, and I'm 38. And strangely enough, at 38, you can feel as abandoned as you did at 18. Jack, my husband, is a truck driver. He earns well, provides me with everything I need, and believes that by coming home every 2 weeks, he's fulfilling his duty. I don't blame him. That's just his nature. Simple, straightforward, devoid of questions. But over the years of living together, I've learned to notice the silence between us. It drained my soul as if someone pulled the blanket off me every night, leaving me to shiver in the cold. Everything changed when Thomas Wilson moved into the house next door. I had never been interested in the neighbors, but his arrival stood out from the gray, routine mass. Thomas was around 50, tall, broad-shouldered, with a straight posture. He looked not just strong, there was something silent and unyielding about him, like a man who had been through a lot but remained steadfast. I learned from Mrs. Little, the chatty old lady from the other end of the street, that Thomas had recently divorced and decided to start his life anew. Poor guy, of course, but what can you do? Life spares no one, Mrs. Little concluded, packing apples from the market into her bag. At first glance, Thomas didn't seem like a poor or lost soul. I often saw him in the yard, dismantling old tools, fixing something on the porch, or just sitting with a book in his hands, sipping coffee. It seemed that this man had order even in his solitude, and for some reason, it annoyed me. How could he be so calm? Why didn't his loneliness scream and shout like mine? That morning, I noticed him through the kitchen window. He was mowing the lawn, moving confidently across his yard. The sun's rays outlined his silhouette, broad shoulders, strong arms. He wore a simple white t-shirt, already slightly damp with sweat. I instinctively ran my hand over the collar of my robe and felt a pang of envy. Envy of his freedom, of the fact that, unlike me, he didn't pretend to be content. I returned to my pots, trying to focus on breakfast, but the sound of the lawnmower was still audible. It shattered the silence that had long settled in this house. "Good morning, Laura," a male voice called out. I jumped and turned around. Thomas was standing by the fence holding some tools in his hand. "Sorry to bother you. Do you happen to have an old wrench? Mine is completely worn out." He smiled, evenly and unobtrusively, as if he knew his request wouldn't be much trouble for me. "Of course, I'll get it right now," I replied, trying to hide the unexpected excitement in my voice. I headed to the garage to find the tool. Deep breaths helped me regain my outward calm. Thomas was just a neighbor, someone life had randomly brought to the street. But when I returned and handed him the wrench, our fingers touched for a moment. He didn't pull his hand away, and neither did I. The moment lasted longer than it should have. "Thank you, Laura," he said softly, looking at me with his calm, expectant gaze. "You're a real lifesaver." I didn't know what to say and just nodded, returning to the house. But at the kitchen door, I suddenly realized, for the first time in a long time, someone had noticed me. And perhaps for the first time, I had noticed someone too. A week had passed since the moment I first stood before Thomas, handing him the wrench. A week filled with seemingly insignificant events. Morning walks in the garden, the clear sounds of his tools from the neighboring yard, and rare encounters at the fence. All of this could have seemed like trivialities if not for the tension that now seemed to permeate the air between us. I saw him almost every day. Thomas was trimming the bushes, tinkering with his old car, or sitting on the porch with a book in his hands. He seemed like a man comfortable in his own company, and this starkly set him apart from other men I knew. I found myself increasingly looking out the window under the pretense of airing out the room or going outside without a clear reason. That day started like any other. Coffee, the warm light of the morning sun, and an empty house. Jack was somewhere on the Ohio highways, and I didn't even need to pretend to be busy. I put on a simple summer dress, light, loose, but a bit more revealing than it should be for ordinary house cleaning. Why not, I thought, looking at my reflection in the mirror. When I went outside, Thomas was already there. He was standing by his car, wiping his hands with a rag. "Good morning," I greeted him, trying to sound casual. He looked up and gazed at me a bit longer than he should have. A warm smile flashed across his face. "Morning, Laura. How are you?" he asked, putting the rag away and leaning slightly against the car. "Wonderful," I replied, though inside I felt a tightness from his attention. "I thought I'd do a bit of gardening while the weather is nice." "Great idea. If you need any help, I'm right here," he added calmly, as if there was nothing special about his words. But his gaze said something else. I bent down to pick up the watering can and felt his eyes on me. It was that gaze men can only hide for a few seconds before it becomes heavy and eloquent. I straightened up, pretending not to notice. "You have golden hands, Thomas. The car looks brand new," I remarked, trying to break the silence. "Thank you," he chuckled, brushing off an imaginary speck of dust from the hood. "Old things need care, just like everything in this world." His words struck me more deeply than they should have. I nodded and returned to my flower beds, but I could feel my heart beating faster than usual. I was a woman who hadn't felt a man's attention for too long, and now it was pouring over me like a warm summer rain. In the evening, I was sitting in the kitchen, drinking tea, when I heard a knock at the door. A million thoughts raced through my mind. Could it be Jack? But when I opened the door, I saw Thomas. He was standing on the porch with some metal part in his hand. "Sorry to bother you. Do you happen to have any WD-40? The car is almost done, but it's stuck a bit," he explained with the same calm confidence. "Sure, I have some." "Just a minute," I replied, letting his gaze linger on me. I was wearing a housecoat, decent enough, but for some reason, in his presence, it felt almost provocative. I returned a minute later, handing him the can of oil. When he took it, our fingers touched again. This time, I didn't want to pull my hand away. Thomas didn't rush to end the moment. "Thank you, Laura," he said softly, looking at me. There was no frivolity or hurry in his eyes, only a calm acknowledgement of something we both knew, but hadn't dared to say aloud. "Always happy to help," I replied, though my voice trembled slightly. When the door closed behind him, I was left in silence. But it wasn't the frightening emptiness I often felt in the house. It was a silence of anticipation, of something greater that was already creeping into my life. This silence both frightened and enchanted me. I don't know exactly when everything spun out of control. It wasn't one big moment, but rather a series of small episodes, innocent on the surface. The way he looked at me, the way his voice changed when he said my name. The silence that filled the space between us felt tangible. Days blended into a monotonous stream. Jack would call from another city, talking about crowded roads and long routes. I pretended to listen, but my mind was already filled with Thomas's voice and his gaze. The next day I saw him on the porch. He was sitting on the steps with a cup of coffee, looking into the distance. I went outside to water the flowers, even though I knew I had already done it once that day. "Good morning," I said when he noticed me. "Morning, Laura," he replied, squinting slightly from the sun. "You're up early today." "If I don't water the flowers, they'll dry up." I felt my cheeks flush slightly from his attention. It was silly, a woman my age blushing from a single glance. But his gaze was so alive, not the empty and familiar look I got from Jack. Thomas looked at me like a woman, not just a neighbor or a convenient backdrop for someone else's life. "You have a beautiful garden," he continued, nodding at the flower beds I was tending to. "It must take a lot of time." "I have plenty of time," I replied with a slight smile. "Sometimes you have plenty of time, but no energy for anything," he said. There was something warm, yet sad in his voice. I looked up and met his gaze. "You sound like someone who knows this from experience." "We all have our past, Laura. I'm letting mine go, slowly." Those words stuck with me. Letting go slowly. I understood all too well what he meant. My own past and present felt like a heavy chain, and I had long lost the key to freedom. "If you want, come over for tea sometime," I blurted out. Thomas paused as if he hadn't expected this, but the next moment he smiled, calmly with a hint of playfulness. "I wouldn't mind. This evening?" "This evening," I confirmed, feeling a shiver run through my fingers. That evening I prepared as if I were expecting not just a neighbor but someone special. I put on a light dress, simple but flattering to my figure. I turned on music in the kitchen and sliced a pie I had baked earlier in the day. When the knock came, My heart leaped. I suddenly feared it might be someone else, the mailman or a neighbor, but it was him. Thomas stood on the porch in a dark shirt with rolled-up sleeves, holding a bottle of wine. "Didn't want to come empty-handed," he said with a slight smile. "Come in." The house was quiet and cozy. I offered him a seat at the kitchen table and poured 2 glasses of wine. "How long has it been since you moved here?" I asked, trying to fill the pause. "About 3 years, but it feels like much longer." "Why?" He pondered for a moment, as if deciding whether to speak. "Because in that time, I feel like I've lost myself. Home, family. When all that crumbles, all that's left is silence. A silence that's hard to fill." I looked at him and saw a reflection of my own life in his words. Thomas was more than just a neighbor. He was a man who understood me without words. "And you?" he asked suddenly. "How do you live here, alone?" "I'm not alone. I have a husband," I replied, but my voice lacked conviction. "Is he away often?" I nodded and looked into my glass. "Often." An uncomfortable pause hung in the air, filled with something invisible yet important. "Laura," he said softly, "sometimes we live not the way we want, but the way we're used to." His words struck a chord deep within me. I looked up and met his gaze. At that moment, I felt like he saw right through me, saw my pain, my empty nights, and the hopes I had long buried. "You're right," I whispered. Thomas didn't move, but the air between us grew thicker, as if someone invisible had pulled a string taut, waiting for it to snap. "I don't want to cross your boundaries," he finally said. "And what if they're already crossed?" I asked, surprising myself. Thomas was silent. His gaze softened, but there was understanding in his eyes, and something else I was afraid to name. I stood up and walked to the window, trying to calm myself. This was a dangerous dance, and I had already taken a step from which there was no return. Thomas stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. "Thank you for the evening, Laura," he said softly. "I should go." "Good night, Thomas." He left, and I was alone in the silence of the house, which no longer felt familiar. I could still smell his scent, a faint aroma of tobacco and cologne, and I understood that something had irrevocably changed. That night was the first when I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, hearing every creak of the floorboards and every rustle outside the window. I felt like he too was awake on the other side of the wall, and at that moment I realized the game had only just begun. After that night, everything changed. We no longer pretended. Nothing had happened, but something invisible and important had shifted in the air between us. Thomas continued his daily routine, fixing things in the garage, mowing the lawn, sitting on the porch with a book. But now every casual glance, every word spoken over the fence or at the doorstep seemed to push the boundaries I had so desperately tried to maintain. I tried to act normal. I washed dishes, watered the flowers, went to the market on Saturdays, and waited for Jack's calls as usual. But even in these simple tasks, I found myself thinking about Thomas. I tried to suppress it. After all, I was a wife. He was just a neighbor. But something inside me no longer wanted to return to the old ways. On the 3rd day after our evening together, Thomas knocked on the door. It was early evening. The sun was slowly setting, painting the sky in golden pink hues. "Good evening, Laura," he said, standing on the porch. "Sorry to bother you. I wanted to bring you something." In his hands was a wooden crate filled with vegetables, peppers, tomatoes, and fresh greens. "What's this?" I asked, looking at him in surprise. "Harvest from the garden. I have too much, can't eat it all alone. Thought you might find it useful." "Thank you," I said softly, taking the crate from his hands. For a moment our fingers touched again, that strange sensation, as if the world paused for a second. "What have you been up to today?" he asked, lingering at the doorstep, as if waiting for an invitation. "Nothing special. Just a day, like any other," I said, and quickly added, "Would you like some tea?" He raised his eyebrows as if he hadn't expected this, but smiled. "I wouldn't mind." We sat on the porch on old wooden chairs. Thomas sipped his tea and I watched his hands, strong yet calm, holding the mug as carefully as if it were delicate porcelain. "Was your wife happy with you?" I suddenly asked, surprising myself with my directness. Thomas slowly lowered his gaze to the mug. "There was a time when she was, but then everything changed. We became strangers. Sometimes people just lose each other, and there's nothing you can do about it. And now? Have you found yourself? I asked, holding his gaze. He looked up and met my eyes. Not yet, but I'm closer than I've ever been. Those words hit me harder than I expected, because I understood that he wasn't just talking about himself. I was just as lost. Thomas set the mug down on the table and suddenly said, "Laura, tell me honestly, are you happy?" I froze. My heart pounded so loudly I could almost hear its echo in my chest. "What kind of question is that?" I whispered. "Just answer." I tried to force a smile but couldn't. "I don't know what happiness is." He nodded as if he understood. The pause between us was long and tense. Thomas didn't take his eyes off me. "You don't need to say anything. I already see it." I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up and walked to the porch railing, clutching my fingers, trying to still the trembling. "Thomas, don't—" I started, but he was already standing behind me. "Laura." His voice was deep, calm, but there was a plea in it. I turned around. He was standing 2 steps away from me. We looked at each other, and in that gaze was everything we were afraid to say aloud. "We can't," I whispered. "I know." He took a step forward but didn't touch me, just his warm breath and that gaze which tore me apart. "You should go, Thomas," I said, but my voice was too weak to sound convincing. He looked at me for another moment, then nodded and stepped back. "Good night, Laura." When he left, I stood on the porch, hugging myself. I felt my boundaries crumbling, and with them, the life I had so carefully built. That night I lay in bed, listening to the ticking of the clock. I thought about his words, his gaze, his soft voice. It seemed like an invisible thread was stretched between our houses. I knew that if I took a step towards him, everything would change, and I was no longer afraid to lose this. I was afraid not to take this step. That night I couldn't sleep. The ticking of the clock in the bedroom sounded especially loud, as if someone was deliberately counting down to a moment I was afraid to acknowledge. Moonlight streamed through the window, casting shadows on the wall that seemed alive. My thoughts kept returning to what had happened on the porch, to his words and his gaze, which burned inside me. "You don't live the way you want, but the way you're used to." Those words swirled in my head, like a voice from the distant past. Thomas saw right through me. He saw the emptiness I had hidden for so long. I turned on my side and looked at the empty space beside me. The sheets on Jack's side were cold, as they usually were. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to banish the intrusive thoughts, but it didn't help. The world outside the window beckoned me, or maybe it was him calling. I got up and put on a light robe. The house was quiet as always, but this silence no longer frightened me. I walked down the hallway, my bare feet touching the cool floor. My heart was pounding in my throat, growing louder with each step. I found myself at the front door and paused. "Turn back and go inside," a voice whispered, but my hands were already on the doorknob. I stepped onto the porch, and the soft night breeze touched my face. The light in Thomas's house was still on. I didn't know how long I stood there. It felt like the night itself was watching me, waiting for me to make a move. And I did. I walked to his door and knocked softly. My fingers trembled, and my breath was shallow. After a few seconds, the door opened. Thomas stood before me. He was barefoot, wearing simple dark pants and a shirt unbuttoned at the collar. His hair was slightly disheveled, as if he had just run his hand through it. He looked at me silently, but his eyes held a question and an answer. "Laura," he said softly, as if afraid to disturb the moment. "I couldn't sleep," I whispered, feeling the words catch in my throat. Thomas didn't say anything. He stepped aside, inviting me in. My feet moved on their own, and there I was, standing in his living room. The room was simple and a bit empty, but there was a warmth to it, just like him. Thomas closed the door and turned to face me. The silence was heavy and soft at the same time. I didn't know what to say, but words weren't needed. Everything was clear. I felt his gaze on me, not as a neighbor or someone else's wife, but as a woman, alive and real. "Are you sure?" he asked. His voice was soft, but there was concern in it. I nodded, unable to speak. Thomas moved closer, and the space between us shrank to almost nothing. I felt the warmth of his body even before he touched me. When his hands rested on my shoulders, I closed my eyes. It felt like a touch of freedom I had denied myself for so long. He leaned in, and our lips met in a soft, tentative kiss that instantly deepened. Everything else happened in a haze. My robe slipped off my shoulders and his hands slid down my back, leaving trails of fire on my skin. Thomas was gentle and patient, as if afraid I might disappear if he rushed. I felt his strength hidden behind every movement, and he gave that strength to me. We didn't speak. There was no need for words when every touch spoke for us. I didn't think about Jack or what tomorrow might bring. I was here now, with Thomas, who had awakened something in me I had buried for so long. When it was over, we lay in silence, and I felt his hand on my waist. His breathing was steady and calm, and for the first time in many years, I breathed easily too. "Laura," he whispered, running his fingers through my hair. "Don't say anything," I whispered back. Because at that moment, nothing needed to be explained. When I returned home, the silence greeted me as it always did. But this time it felt different. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, letting my breath escape from my chest where it had been pressing heavily. The house was dark and empty, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid of that emptiness. It felt like my soul had already left its walls and was wandering somewhere far away, where Thomas was. I went upstairs and entered the bedroom. The sheets on Jack's side were still cold, and I looked at them with a faint smile. This bed had always been empty. Empty not physically, but on a deeper level, in the soul. I suddenly felt like I could still feel the warmth of Thomas's hands on my skin, his breath on my temple, his gaze that saw me for who I truly was. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of the phone ringing. Jack's name flashed on the screen. I picked up, trying to sound as normal and familiar as possible. "Hey, Laura," he said in his calm voice. "Everything okay at home?" "Yes," I replied, looking out the window at the neighboring house. "Everything's the same. And you?" "Busy, on the road. I'll be back by the end of the week. Might come back a bit earlier." "Okay," I replied automatically. We exchanged a few more words and Jack hung up. I held the phone in my hand, staring into space. His voice no longer stirred anything in me. Just a faint, almost familiar regret that things had gone this far. All day I tried to keep busy, rearranging books on the shelf, washing curtains, baking a pie no one was waiting for. I avoided looking at Thomas's house, but my thoughts were there nonetheless. What now? The question hung in the air, unanswered. By evening, I couldn't take it anymore. I went outside and sat on the porch step, hugging my knees. The sky was turning dark blue, and the air was heavy with the promise of a storm. I heard footsteps and looked up. Thomas was walking towards me across the lawn, holding a cup of coffee. He stopped at the foot of the porch and looked at me. His face was calm, but his eyes held a question. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. "Of course not." He sat down next to me. We were silent for a while, listening to the distant rumble of thunder. Finally, he spoke. "Do you regret it?" I didn't answer right away. "I don't know," I said, looking at him. "Do you?" Thomas nodded, gazing thoughtfully into the distance. "Number. But I'm worried about you, Laura." "I'm worried about myself, too," I whispered almost inaudibly. He placed his hand on mine, and I didn't pull away. "I'm not asking for anything," he said. "I know this is difficult." I nodded, unable to meet his gaze. "Thomas," I started but couldn't find the words. He gently squeezed my hand. "You don't owe me any explanations." I suddenly felt tears welling up in my throat. I hadn't cried in years, and now this surge of emotions threatened to overwhelm me. "I don't know what to do next," I confessed. "Live," he replied simply. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the first drops of rain began to fall on the porch. Thomas stood up and offered me his hand. "Let's go inside." I took his hand and we went in. My heart was pounding so loudly it seemed to drown out the sound of the rain. When Thomas left that evening, I stood by the window, watching his silhouette disappear into the darkness. My life would never be the same, and I knew it. I had crossed a line, one I had drawn for myself. But was it real, or did it only exist in my mind? The next day I received a message from Jack. Stuck for a couple more days. Everything okay with you? I stared at the screen for a long time, wondering what to reply. Finally, I wrote, yes, everything's fine. Don't rush. In the evening, I went out to the porch again. Thomas was sitting on his porch with a book, but I knew he was looking at me. There was distance between us, but the silence was gone.